My name is Sam Sweeney. So I think David just kind of mentioned this, but a quick overview of my background. I was previously a software engineer at Google in the Venice Beach office, where I worked for about 3.5 years. And prior to that, I was up in SF working at Uber and a startup called Wealthfront. I'm also a proud a bootcamp graduate. I went to App Academy in New York City in 2014. So just wanted to give a shout out to all of the other bootcamp grads, hopefully in the audience right now. And I am now the founder of an app called Trivy, which I'll be talking about in this presentation a bit. Awesome. So basically the story of Trivy is that while I was at Google, I wanted to build an app to play trivia with my friends with an app. And kind of here's what you see, the kind of first version. And so the first version was just kind of like a vanilla Rails app. Anytime I'm starting like an application project, people have their kind of go-to stack, and that's Rails for me. And it was really kind of like follow the Rails philosophy of kind of primarily having a server-driven application, server-side rendering, and really kind of using minimal JavaScript kind of only where necessary. So like in this picture, you can imagine like the countdown timer here. Looking at this page, I think only the countdown timer uses JavaScript and everything else is just purely server-side, is purely server-driven. And so I built this, it was fun. I played with my friends a bit. You would kind of like have a week to play your game. And the next kind of version or the next kind of iteration of the app that I wanted to build was like a live version of the app. So I'm sure everyone over the past year has had this experience of basically taking your happy hours off sites and moving them onto Zoom. And I wanted to build, I had seen kind of some of the products in this space, and I thought that there was a lot of room for improvement, because a lot of times when people play trivia online, it's kind of a kludgy mixture of, Zoom and Slack and Google Forms and whatnot. And I kind of wanted to use an app to make a better experience. And so here, this is kind of what I had in mind is you'd have, some number of players who all see the same screen, they can answer a question. And then you have like a trivia host who is able to control what people see and kind of guide them through the game. And so my first thought was that I did not want to kind of build a single page application. I think that if I were starting from scratch, and if people in the audience here, given this is js.la, we're starting from scratch, I think you want like a rich interactive browser app. You would use React, Angular, Vue, whatever kind of your front end stack of choices, and have basically a lot of the complexity of your application client side. And mainly because for two reasons I wanted to avoid this. One is I already had this application where I had all of my kind of trivia logic, as it were, that was server side. And secondly, it's been a while, frankly, since I had worked with these kind of frameworks. And I'm a big believer in kind of sticking to the technologies that And so I started to look around, kind of asking myself, is there a way I can use what I already have and build this kind of live trivia experience? And kind of after a little bit of Googling, I came across a framework that's called Stimulus Reflex. This is kind of a wall of text that explains from their docs, that explains what it does. If you like docs, you can go check this out after the talk. But more or less, this is a way to build a interactive and reactive application using Ruby on Rails with kind of minimal effort is the promise. And so what are kind of the building blocks of Stimulus Reflex? And this is going to be relevant for later in the talk. There are a couple parts. One is that it heavily uses WebSockets. So this probably comes as no surprise to anyone who's built like a multiplayer game. But WebSockets, is a persistent connection between the client and the server. And for our purposes, the most important feature is that it's a two-way connection. So the client can send a request up to the server, and the server can also push down data. So for instance, if I'm the host and I hit next question, I can push down that update to all the players. Secondly, how does that actually happen? There's a library called CableReady, which is actually built on Action Cable, where you can broadcast DOM operations from your server. And I'll be talking about this in a slide or two, but you can basically think of operations that you would do client-side in JavaScript to modify your DOM, calling those same functions on your server, which is actually super cool and super powerful. Thirdly, and this is the star of the show tonight, I know this got a shout out in the capsule talk, uses Morph Dom, which is really cool library for diffing and patching your kind of changes to your DOM, which I'll talk about in a second. And then lastly, it uses this library from Basecamp, the makers of Rails, called Stimulus.js, which I'm not going to talk about too much, but it's basically a kind of lightweight library that lets you do kind of, it cuts out a lot of boilerplate for your application for writing simple interactions in JavaScript. So yeah, I mentioned cable ready. And this is kind of, I think, relevant for this audience, where you can look at all of these operations, and these are all available server side. And so, for instance, enter HTML, you would call an element .enter HTML and set it to something. Being able to do that on your server, and then the equivalent JavaScript operation gets called client side, or adding or taking away a CSS class, or dispatching an event, and all these different kind of browser APIs that we as JavaScript developers are used to dealing with, but calling them server side and being able to broadcast them to a group of users. And so what does that look like? As we can see here, this is the first part is what would be the JavaScript version of this code. So we'd get an element, we call enter HTML. In Ruby, in our Rails application, this is kind of the syntax. You have basically different channels over WebSockets, and you would call .enter HTML. This is one of those operations. We pass it a selector. Here we're saying the same thing. This is the same as get element by ID. And then here I'm passing just a string that is our HTML, but you can imagine rendering a template or kind of what makes sense. And then you call broadcast, and then it will broadcast this update over WebSockets, and it will be applied via Morph Dom to clients. And just quickly, Morph Dom, it is a library that will update your DOM. It will apply changes to your DOM in the most efficient way. So first, you can pass it two different elements, and you can say make element 1 look like element 2, and it will perform the the smallest number of changes necessary to make that change. And so here, you can see this happening. We have 2 L's. And here, this is probably closer to what cable ready actually does, with where I pass a string of HTML, and you can use Morph Dom in that respect as well. So one thing I wanted to call out here is that this is actually, I just want to kind of take a step back. Stimulus Reflex is inspired by this library called LiveView, which uses the Phoenix framework, which is written with the Elixir programming language. And this, I saw this animation a while ago. It actually took me a while to find it, and it's really incredible. This rainbow here, you can see it kind of undulating. This is all done. There's basically no JavaScript. This is all done with server-side rendering, where the server is recalculating what that wave should look like and just sending down frame after frame after frame. And this is kind of the performance that you're able to achieve with this type of approach, which this is, I think, really impressive. And so how does this apply to Trivy? So this is I kind of read about this for a while, and I kind of, thought about it for a bit, and this was kind of what I wanted to do. First, I wanted to reuse my server-side templates. These are written in ERB, which is like a Ruby templating language. So basically, I wouldn't have to duplicate or rewrite my existing code. I realized I needed to kind of maintain the state of the live game in my database with basically a view model, where, for instance, if you go from the gameplay to the scoreboard, you would have a field that says current stage, for instance, and the admin, sorry, as you can see here in this next bullet, the admin is able to mutate this view model and then broadcast the update. And that way, if you're playing and you need to hit the refresh button, you'll still have the consistent state. And then we can kind of, so far I've talked about, and for the most of this talk, I'm going to talk about kind of the core game experience, but you can imagine the same pattern applying to different parts of the application. So I had a bunch of other features that I wanted to build, and you can use this kind of stimulus reflex pattern for those components as well. And so, yeah, let's just kind of walk through an example in the application and kind of go step by step as to what actually happens. So here's like the admin view of the game. We have this next, so the admin sees the same thing or the host or the admin, whichever you want to call it, sees the same view as all of the players, except they have this little panel here where they can change the state of the game. And so let's say you're hosting a game for your friends and you hit next question. what actually happens. So the first thing is that one cool thing about stimulus reflex is, as I kind of pointed out earlier, there is a lot of JavaScript involved here. It's just you're really not the one writing it, which can be a really positive thing. So for instance, you can add a data reflex attribute here, and this will call server-side code. So this says on click for a live season reflex, which is a class in your Rails application, call the select question method. And so this will cause sorry, the second image is a little small, the text is a little small, but this will cause a message to be sent over WebSockets to your server that says invoke this, this method and all the data attributes. You actually can access the element in Ruby with all, you see I have all these data attributes. And so what's cool about this is really kind of blurring the lines between, or taking things that you traditionally do client side in JavaScript and putting them on the server with Ruby and Rails. And then, yeah, here's kind of an example of what you would do in your reflex. This kind of goes back to what I was talking about with cable ready. You kind of would mutate your model that represents this game, and then you can render whatever your template is and call inner HTML on the kind of the container element and broadcast it to all of the users who will be subscribing to this live season ID channel. And then client side, this is all you really need to do for each of the players is you need to subscribe to the given channel. So here, this is just the syntax. You can see we're using the cable ready library, and we are subscribing to this live season channel, and then you can scope it to a given ID. So I don't want to receive updates if there are 2 games being played on trivia at once. I don't want to receive someone else's updates. So I use the ID of my live season, which is another term for live game. And then as you can see here, you call cable ready. When you get data, you call cable ready.perform those operations, and it can have any one of those operations that we talked about previously. Quickly, I want to go through like a second example of like a feature that I built here. So this is just kind of like a standard who are the users online. And right now, all of these dots are gray, but you can imagine when Clara comes online, this dot would become kind of pulsing in green to show that she's currently online. And what was tricky about this is that it's actually kind of difficult in your Rails application to get a list of the currently online users just because of how the WebSocket state is maintained. And so I kind of like thought about this for a little while. It's kind of hard. There's no like get online users API with Action Cable, the WebSocket library in Rails. And so I ended up using JavaScript to solve this problem. And so I had kind of seen this pattern in a couple of different situations in my my professional career, and I kind of thought about it for a while. And I thought it made sense here, where basically I just have, when you're online in the game, you send a kind of a regular heartbeat to the server, basically saying, "Hey, I'm online," and then anytime you go offline or you navigate away from the page or you close the page, you send a signal saying, "Hey, I'm offline." And so what does that look like? We just use the set interval API, we send a heartbeat. And this here, I talked about invoking a reflex from the data reflex attribute. This is an example of where you can also invoke that from JavaScript. And this is actually in what's known as a stimulus controller, which is the stimulus.js library. Cool, so this is just to put it all together. This is kind of an example of what a live game looks like if it loads. Let's see. Here we go. So as you can see, there are a couple of different components. All of these use stimulus reflex. This is from the viewpoint of one of the players. I actually have like a live stream embedded in the site. And we have a chat room here where this uses stimulus reflex, and we broadcast those DOM operations to all the people that subscribe to the chat room. We have our little users online in the bottom left. I built this kind of fun little WebRTC audio call for all the players on a team to talk to each other. And yeah, I think that's about it. I also have this fun little emojis thing where you can basically broadcast emojis to everyone else who's playing. And so there is some, JavaScript here, obviously, to get some of these operations. It does take some. You can't just broadcast operations purely from the server. However, a lot of this is basically calling client-side operations server-side, and so you're able to broadcast these updates to everyone. And for me, I think ultimately, like, what matters is your productivity and like how much you enjoy working with a library. And for me, I found myself very productive, and I really enjoyed it. And so, yeah, what is my high-level takeaway here? I would say, like, and this is something that I kind of only realized over time, is like, when you're starting off a project, think about where, all applications will have some complexity. Just think about where you want it to live. Is this going to be primary? I think as JavaScript developers, we all can kind of default to say, oh, I should put all my state in the client. That's what I know. That's what I love. But there are other options out there. I think is my takeaway. And you can be in the front end. For me, it was kind of in the back end by default. And I think the best is when you can offload your complexity to a library. And that's kind of the story, I would say, of what happened here. I have some other fun stories about building this app. I think there's like a networking thing after this, so would love to chat with these about people if they're interested. Yeah, like I said, I built in like a live stream using WebRTC. I load tested my app, kind of wiring together AWS Lambdas and using Puppeteer to like have like bots, basically like 50, 100 bots click through my site and kind of do some load testing. And yeah, I have some fun stories about like when I hosted games with some engineers who try to hack your app in real time, which is really fun. So yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate everyone listening, and thanks again to the organizers. I'm looking forward to talking with everyone.